We are conditioned to believe that the global banking system is a neutral utility, like the water pipes in your house or the electricity grid. It's supposed to be boring, invisible, and available to everyone who pays their bills. That is the lie. The reality is that the financial system is not a utility. It is a weapon. And on the 26th of February 2022, the West pulled the trigger. When the US and EU disconnected Russia from SWIFT, they didn't just freeze assets. They weaponized the plumbing of the global economy. They turned the network itself into a battlefield. The media called it a necessary sanction. I call it the financial nuclear option. But here is the paradox that should terrify you. You cannot detonate a nuclear bomb in a closed room without radiation poisoning yourself. By deleting a G20 nation from the financial map, the West sent a message to the rest of the world. Your money is not yours. It is ours, and we are just letting you hold it. This single decision broke a 50-year-old trust. It started a chain reaction that is now silently dismantling the US dollar's dominance. And while the headlines focus on Putin or Zelensky, the real casualty isn't in Moscow. The radiation is hitting your purchasing power, your 401, and your grocery bill. Let me walk you through the crime scene. To understand the crime, you must understand the weapon. Most investors believe SWIFT is a global bank where money is stored. That is incorrect. SWIFT holds $0. SWIFT Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication is simply a secure messaging app. Think of it as WhatsApp for banks. When a company in Texas buys steel from Japan, money doesn't physically fly across the ocean. A message flies across the SWIFT network, code to code. If the message doesn't arrive, the money doesn't move. Technically, SWIFT is a neutral cooperative based in Belgium, but in practice, it is the ultimate global panopticon. The panopticon was a prison design where a single guard could watch every inmate without being seen. SWIFT is that guard. It tracks 44 million transactions a day. Because nearly 80% of global trade is invoiced in dollars or euros, the West holds the master key to this prison. They don't just see the money, they control the language of value itself. If you are deleted from SWIFT, you aren't just unbanked. You are rendered deaf and mute in the global marketplace. You cannot buy medicine, you cannot sell oil. You are instantly reverted to the 19th century. This was the trap laid for Russia. Not a military siege, but a digital suffocation. In forensic history, there are specific dates that mark the exact moment an empire overplays its hand. For the British Empire, it was the Suez Crisis in 1956. For the US dollar hegemony, it was the 26th of February 2022. On that Saturday, the United States and the European Union committed an act that was previously unthinkable. They deplatformed a G20 nation. They didn't just sanction oligarchs. They disconnected major Russian banks from SWIFT and, more critically, froze roughly $300 billion of Russia's central bank reserves held offshore. To understand why this was the crossing of the Rubicon, you have to look at the Cold War. For 45 years, the US and the Soviet Union had thousands of nuclear missiles pointed at each other. They fought proxy wars in Vietnam, Korea, and Afghanistan. Yet, throughout that entire bloody half-century, the banking channels remained open. The Soviets sold oil. The West paid in dollars. The clearinghouses in New York and London were considered sacred, neutral ground. The unwritten rule of global finance was simple. We may kill each other on the battlefield, but the debts must be paid, and the ledger must be honored. In 2022, Washington tore up that rulebook. By weaponizing the central plumbing of the financial system against a nuclear superpower, the West transformed the US dollar from a store of value into a political tool. The immediate tactical goal was to crash the ruble and stop the tanks in Ukraine. But the strategic consequence was a disaster. In boardrooms across Beijing, Riyadh, and Brasilia, the realization hit like a lightning bolt. If the United States can cancel the savings account of a sovereign nation like Russia overnight, they can do it to us. Sovereign immunity was dead. The concept of safe haven was exposed as a myth. The trust that took 80 years to build since the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944 was evaporated in a single weekend. The system didn't break by accident. It was broken on purpose. Let's perform a forensic autopsy on the crime scene. How do you physically freeze $300 billion of a nuclear superpower's money? Most people imagine FBI agents raiding vaults or seizing pallets of cash in Moscow. That is Hollywood fiction. In the modern financial system, money does not move. Only data moves. And this is where the trap lies. To understand the rigging, you must understand a concept called correspondent banking. If you are the central bank of Russia and you want to hold 100 billion US dollars to stabilize your currency, you do not pile cash in a basement in the Kremlin. You cannot hold US dollars outside of the US banking system. Instead, You open a digital account with a US bank like JP Morgan or the Federal Reserve itself. The numbers on the screen say 100 billion, but the legal reality is terrifying. That money never left New York. What Russia actually owned was not money, but a claim on a US bank. In accounting terms, Russia's asset was the US bank's liability. So, on the 26th of February 2022, the US Treasury didn't need to send in the Marines. They simply sent a directive to the ledger keepers in New York. They changed the status of Russia's account from active to blocked. Click. Done. Instantly, $300 billion. The accumulated wealth of the Russian people meant for rainy days became inaccessible. It was still there, sitting on the American ledgers, but Russia's password had been deleted. This revealed the systemic flaw of the global financial architecture. There is no such thing as digital property rights. There is only digital permission. If you hold your wealth in a currency controlled by a rival, you are not saving money. You are buying an option that can be revoked at any moment. The system is designed so that the house, the issuer of the currency, always retains the ultimate kill switch. Russia thought they owned the asset. The mechanism proved they were merely renting space on someone else's server. When the US Treasury froze Russia's assets, Washington expected the world to applaud their moral stance. They miscalculated. While Europe cheered, the rest of the world, the global south, went silent. In the palaces of Riyadh, the boardrooms of Beijing, and the government halls of New Delhi, a cold realization set in. They weren't looking at why Russia was punished. They were looking at how it was done. For decades, countries bought US Treasury bonds because they were defined as the risk-free asset. It was the foundation of global finance. You park your money in dollars because the US is the only adult in the room who promises to honor its debts, no matter what. On the 26th of February 2022, that promise was broken. The message received by the global south was clear. The US dollar is no longer a neutral currency. It is a political weapon. If you disagree with American foreign policy, your national savings can be deleted. Consider Saudi Arabia. They have operated under the petrodollar agreement since 1974, selling oil exclusively in dollars in exchange for US protection. But when they saw Russia's $300 billion vanish, they had to ask a terrifying question. If we disagree with the US on human rights or climate policy in the future, will our assets be next? This fear triggered the greatest gold rush in modern history. In 2022 and 2023, central banks bought more gold than at any time since 1950. Why gold? Because gold has no counterparty risk. You don't need SWIFT to hold gold. You don't need America's permission to own it. The US accidentally told the world that the only safe money is money you physically control. This wasn't just a sanction, it was a massive marketing campaign for de-dollarization. And for the first time in history, the customers China, Brazil, India, Saudi Arabia decided to shop elsewhere. The psychological bond was severed. The risk-free asset is now officially risk-full. In military strategy, there is a golden rule. Never use a weapon that forces your enemy to build a better shield. By weaponizing SWIFT, the West committed a fatal strategic error. They destroyed the network effect that kept the dollar dominant. Before 2022, nations used the dollar because it was convenient. After 2022, nations are building alternatives because the dollar is dangerous. We are now witnessing the rapid rise of a shadow financial system completely outside of American jurisdiction. Look at the evidence. Russia, cut off from SWIFT, immediately switched to its own internal system, SPFS. It's clunky, it's slower, but it works. More importantly, China accelerated the adoption of CIPS, Cross-Border Interbank Payment System. This is the anti-SWIFT. It allows banks to clear transactions directly in yuan, bypassing the US banking system and the US inquisitive eyes entirely. The results are staggering. Before the sanctions, trade between Russia and China was largely settled in dollars. Today, over 90% of it is settled in rubles and yuan. We created a self-fulfilling prophecy. Washington feared that the yuan would challenge the dollar, so they used sanctions to punish bad actors. But those very sanctions became the greatest catalyst for yuan adoption in history. We forced our adversaries to innovate. We forced the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, to stop talking and start building. They are now actively developing a shared currency unit and a digital payment rail that no Western bank can freeze. The monopoly is broken. We have moved from a unipolar financial world where all roads lead to New York to a bipolar financial world. And here's the kicker. When trade happens on these new alternative rails, the US loses more than just prestige. We lose visibility. We can no longer track the money, sanction the bad guys, or enforce our laws. By trying to control everything, we lost the ability to see anything. You might be watching this and thinking, okay, so Russia and China are trading in yuan. How does a frozen bank account in Moscow affect a family in Ohio? The answer lies in your grocery bill, your rent, and the value of your savings. For 80 years, the United States has enjoyed what economists call an exorbitant privilege. We could print limitless amounts of paper, dollars, send them abroad, and in exchange, the world sent us real things. Cars from Japan, oil from Saudi Arabia, electronics from China. Why did they take our paper? Because they needed to save it in their central banks as safe reserves. Effectively, we exported our inflation to the rest of the world. We got the goods, they got the inflation. But when we weaponized the dollar in 2022, we broke the machine. As nations aggressively de-dollarize to avoid the SWIFT trap, the global demand for holding US dollars drops. So, what happens to those trillions of dollars that are no longer wanted abroad? They come home. This is the economic tsunami that no politician will discuss. When foreign nations stop buying US debt, those dollars flood back into the domestic US economy. They start chasing real assets inside America. This is not just supply chain issues. This is currency repatriation. When you see housing prices in Florida or Texas skyrocketing, when you see a cart of groceries costing $150, you are witnessing the dilution of your currency caused by a shrinking empire. The sanction tax is being paid by you. By using the financial system as a weapon of war, the US government has inadvertently turned off the vacuum cleaner that sucked up excess dollars from the global market. The result? A structural, long-term decline in the American standard of living. The era of cheap imports is ending because the world is no longer willing to subsidize our debt in exchange for a currency that can be canceled with a mouse click. You are not just losing purchasing power because of corporate greed. You are losing it because the global premium on the dollar is evaporating. The weapon we fired at Russia has ricocheted, and it just hit your wallet. In forensic economics, there is a fundamental law. Wealth is never destroyed. It is merely transferred. If the American middle class is getting poorer due to inflation, and the Russian economy is isolated, where did the value go? To find the answer, you have to ask the oldest question in history. Cui bono? Who benefits? While you are paying double for gas and groceries, specific sectors of the elite economy are enjoying a golden age. First, follow the energy. When the US cut Europe off from cheap Russian gas, Europe didn't stop needing energy, they just switched suppliers. They started buying liquefied natural king, LNG, from the United States at a 400% markup. Major US energy giants posted record-breaking profits in 2022 and 2023. The sanction on Russia was effectively a massive subsidy for Western energy conglomerates. Second, follow the weapons. A divided world is a profitable world. The weaponization of SWIFT created global paranoia. Poland, Germany, and Japan immediately ramped up military spending. Who fulfills those orders? The US military-industrial complex. Stocks of companies like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon surged as the world rearmed. Peace is bad for business. Fragmentation is the ultimate growth strategy. Third, follow the debt. The inflation caused by this economic war forced the Federal Reserve to hike interest rates. Who wins when rates are high? Big banks. Small businesses are crushed by expensive loans, but the too big to fail banks earn massive interest on their reserves. We are witnessing a consolidation of power where small players die, and the giants inherit the market share. This is not a broken system. It is a system working exactly as designed. The chaos of de-dollarization acts as a giant centrifuge. It spins the wealth away from the middle class via inflation and concentrates it into the hands of the asset owners, the energy tycoons, and the defense contractors. You are being told this is a war for democracy. In financial terms, it looks more like a hostile takeover of global wealth. The powers that be are not blind. They see the same charts I do. They know the SWIFT network is leaking and that the global south is building an exit door. So, what is their plan B? If they can no longer control the rails, SWIFT, they must control the token itself. Enter CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. Do not confuse this with crypto. It is the exact opposite. Bitcoin is decentralized freedom. CBDC is centralized surveillance. The Federal Reserve, the ECB, and the Bank of England are all rushing to launch digital currencies. Why? Because CBDCs solve the Russia problem perfectly. With SWIFT, the US had to pressure Belgian bureaucrats to block Russian banks. It was messy and slow. With a digital dollar, the Federal Reserve is the bank. They can turn off a nation's or an individual's purchasing power with a single line of code. No sanctions meeting required. But here is the terrifying upgrade: programmability. CBDCs allow the issuer to dictate how money is spent. Imagine a stimulus check that expires if not spent in 30 days. Imagine money that cannot be used to buy gasoline if you have exceeded your carbon footprint limit. Imagine money that cannot be used to buy ammunition or donate to the wrong political party. SWIFT was a blunt instrument. It blew up the whole economy. CBDCs are a surgical scalpel. They allow the state to bypass commercial banks and control your wallet directly. The chaos of 2022 didn't end the desire for control. It accelerated the technology for total control. The death of SWIFT is simply the birth pangs of the digital gulag. We have now entered the post-neutral era of finance. The illusion that money is apolitical died on the 26th of February 2022. The banking system is no longer a vault. It is a surveillance grid. The dollar is no longer a store of value. It is a geopolitical leash. And with the arrival of CBDCs, that leash is about to become a chokehold. So, how do you protect yourself when the safe haven becomes the trap? The only way to win a rigged game is not to play by their rules. You must move a portion of your wealth into assets that have no counterparty risk. Assets that do not rely on SWIFT, do not need a bank's permission to move, and cannot be deleted by a politician. History offers two arcs for this flood. 1. Gold and silver, the timeless shield. It is physical, anonymous, and has outlived every paper currency empire for 5,000 years. 2. Bitcoin, the digital shield. It is the only asset in the world that is truly decentralized. It has no CEO to arrest, no server to bomb, and no printing press to dilute your savings. The elite know this. Why do you think central banks are buying record amounts of gold? Why do you think BlackRock is rushing into Bitcoin? They are building their lifeboats while telling you to stay on the Titanic. The global financial order is resetting. The West is losing its monopoly, and the transition will be chaotic, inflationary, and violent. Do not be the last person holding paper promises when the music stops. Become your own bank. Because in the world of weaponized finance, if you don't hold the private keys, you don't own the money. You have been warned.